I told my daughter her father just died. She said, "It's Marcus's birthday. Can we talk tomorrow?" That was the moment I realized I didn't just lose a husband. I lost a daughter too. She never showed up to the funeral, but 3 weeks later she got a letter from my lawyer. She opened it and froze. I did something she will never forget, and I never said a word. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe. And please tell me and others, what's one life lesson everyone should hear before it's too late? Share it in the comments below. Thanks. Robert died right there at the kitchen table, halfway through a joke about how I'd bought the wrong kind of bread again. "If I drop dead from this gluten-free nonsense," he said, chuckling, tapping his fork against the side of his plate, "you'll finally know real guilt." Then his hand twitched. The fork slipped. His eyes widened, like he'd forgotten how to breathe. I dropped the butter dish I was holding and ran to him, screaming his name, but he was already gone. His body went limp before I could even call 911, before my knees hit the tile, before I could ask him if it was another one of his goddamn jokes. It wasn't. The operator's voice in my ear was calm, while my world split open. I kept whispering his name while they guided me through chest compressions, but I already knew. I knew from the way his head slumped against his shoulder, from how cold his fingers felt when I tried to hold them. When the paramedics arrived, I stepped aside, numb, hearing words like massive, unrecoverable, DNR, and I just nodded. The house felt suddenly too loud and too quiet at the same time. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor, and after they'd covered him, after they'd told me there was nothing more they could do, I picked up my phone. I called Sarah, my only daughter. It rang 5 times. When she finally answered, I was shaking, but I managed to say, "Sarah, it's Dad. He just collapsed. He's dead." There was a pause, and then her voice, flat, distracted, said, "Oh Mom, today's Marcus's birthday. Can I call you later?" I didn't even understand the words at first. I thought I'd hallucinated them, but then she added, "He's got this whole party planned, and we've got people over." I said nothing, not a scream, not a sob, just silence. My hand lowered the phone on instinct. I hung up on my own daughter before I could hear anything else that would break me even further. The room around me started to hum like my ears were filling with pressure. I looked over at Robert's chair, the one he always sat in for breakfast, for late-night crossword puzzles, the one he was still slumped in, and I just sat beside him for what felt like an hour, holding his hand like it would bring him back. At some point, the coroner came. They asked if I wanted a moment. I didn't. What was the point? The moment I needed was gone. I went upstairs, locked the door, and lay down on our bed without changing the sheets. Robert's phone was on the nightstand. I picked it up, hoping there'd be something. And there was a missed call log from last night. 10:42 p.m., 1 missed call to Sarah. No voicemail, no answer. Robert tried to talk to her last night. Maybe he knew something was wrong. Maybe he felt it, and our daughter ignored it. I held the phone to my chest and felt the weight of everything we'd built. 42 years of marriage, a house full of memories, a man who worked every damn day to make sure his family never went without. And the silence from Sarah rang louder than any eulogy ever could. The day of Robert's funeral felt like stepping into a parallel universe where I could see everyone's lips moving but hear nothing except the screaming silence of Sarah's absence. I stood by the casket, gripping the edges of the podium, trying to keep my balance, while people I hadn't seen in years came up and whispered things like, "He was such a good man, and we're so sorry." And all I could think about was how my daughter, my only child, was not there, not in the pews, not standing beside me, not even in the damn parking lot. When I called the night before to confirm the funeral time, Marcus answered and told me Sarah was still thinking about it because they had already booked a weekend getaway and cancellation fees are steep this close to the date. I remember staring at the phone, blinking, as he rambled about how Marcus's birthday was important too, and that she was trying to keep things light for the sake of her own mental health. I didn't even respond. I just hung up. I didn't want to beg for attendance at a funeral, especially not for Robert's. Not when he was the one who stayed up all night with a colicky Sarah, who spent weekends building dollhouses and teaching her how to balance a checkbook by age 12. And not when Robert called Sarah the night before he died and never got a call back. People noticed. Of course they did. The whispers started before the service even began. Where's Sarah? Did she miss her flight? Is Marcus okay? Like they were the ones we should be worried about. Even Robert's college friend Frank leaned over and said, "I thought your girl would be front and center today." And I just nodded, like it wasn't breaking me in half. But the moment that really shattered me came after the service, when one of Robert's co-workers, Brian, approached me by the coffee urn in the fellowship hall and said, "I don't mean to pry, but Robert mentioned something odd in passing last month about helping Sarah out financially. Seemed stressed about it." That stopped me cold because Robert never told me anything like that. We had no secrets. Or so I thought. I didn't ask Brian to elaborate. I just thanked him for coming and excused myself to the restroom, where I sat on the toilet seat lid and stared at the floor until someone knocked, asking if everything was okay. Everything was not okay. My daughter missed her father's funeral for a party and a weekend getaway, and now I was hearing hints of financial stress and secrecy. When I got home that night, the silence in the house was unbearable. I poured myself a glass of wine, stared at Robert's armchair, and tried not to think about how cold and alone I felt. Then I opened my phone and saw a photo Marcus had posted on Instagram, him in a bright blue shirt holding a beer, captioned, "Best birthday ever, love my wife." It had been posted during the funeral, during the eulogy. I stared at the screen until the image blurred and my hands started to shake. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed, reaching instinctively for the weight of Robert's hand beside me, and came up empty. At around 3 a.m., I got up, opened Robert's desk drawer, and started pulling out paperwork, bank statements, insurance records, old receipts, anything that might explain what Brian had said. Because now it wasn't just grief. Now there was something else, something colder, a sense that maybe I didn't know the full story of my own family. And the one person who could have answered everything, Robert, was gone. The next morning, I woke up with a mission, not out of curiosity, but out of something sharper, something closer to rage disguised as grief. And I went straight to Robert's filing cabinet, the one he kept locked, but always said I had the spare key for, which I did, taped to the back of our wedding photo in the closet, like some quaint little gesture of trust that now felt more like a test. I opened the drawer and started going through folders, thick with years of tax returns, retirement plans, bank statements organized by month and year, like a man who never expected to die mid-sentence. It didn't take long to find it, a slim blue folder labeled Sarah Transfers. I sat down, heart pounding, and flipped through a timeline of quiet betrayal. Regular wire transfers from Robert's account to Sarah's. $2,000 here, $3,500 there, and one that made my hands go cold, $12,000 labeled Urgent Marcus Medical. I stared at the numbers, like they might change if I blinked hard enough. There were 15 transfers in the past 18 months. I had no idea. Robert never told me. We didn't keep secrets. We'd agreed on that the day we merged bank accounts and picked out a crib together. I kept reading, searching for a clue, something to make it make sense. That's when I found it. A letter folded and tucked between the last two statements. It was handwritten on yellow legal pad paper, the kind Robert always kept on his desk. And it wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Sarah. Sarah, it read, "This is the second time you've told your mother one thing and done another. I've kept quiet because I wanted to believe you were being honest, but if you lie about Marcus's expenses again, or if I find out you've used this money for anything other than what you said, I'll have no choice but to cut you off completely. I love you, but I won't let you take advantage of your mother's trust. It wasn't signed, but I knew Robert's handwriting, like I knew the creases of his palm. He never sent it. It was dated 2 weeks before he died. I sat there staring at it, my hand trembling, the edges of the paper crinkling in my grip. My mind kept returning to the way Sarah's voice sounded over the phone after I told her father died. Calm, inconvenienced, like I was asking her to cancel a dentist appointment. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't cry. I just sat there, trapped in this horrible realization that the man I loved had spent the last months of his life quietly battling our daughter's lies while shielding me from the fallout. And now Sarah, who couldn't be bothered to show up to the funeral, had accepted tens of thousands of dollars while pretending nothing was wrong. I put the folder back in the drawer, locked it, and tucked the key back behind the photo where it belonged. Not out of respect, but because I needed time to think, not just about the money or the lies, but about what it all meant, about what kind of person my daughter had become, and whether I had the strength to do what Robert clearly hadn't been able to finish. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place Robert had died 5 days ago, and stared at the same coffee mug he'd held, still unwashed in the sink. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing. I was done pretending everything was fine. She showed up unannounced on a Wednesday, 5 days after the funeral, as if that somehow made it okay, as if grief had an expiration date, and her delayed appearance could still count for something. But when I opened the door and saw Sarah standing there with her hands in her jacket pockets and that hollow, uncomfortable look in her eyes, I didn't feel relief. I felt calculation, like she'd come not out of sorrow but obligation, or worse, damage control. Behind her was Marcus, sitting in their car, idling in the driveway, like he was ready to drive off the second it got uncomfortable, which told me everything before she even opened her mouth. "Mom," she said, and I stepped aside without a word, leading her into the living room where Robert's chair still sat untouched, a silent monument to everything Sarah had ignored. I offered her coffee out of habit, but she declined, fidgeting on the edge of the couch like she was waiting for a commercial break so she could escape. And when she finally spoke, it was with a strained sort of politeness. "Marcus thinks I should have come sooner, and he's probably right." And I wanted to laugh because of course she was the one who told him. Of course it took his permission, not love or guilt or a conscience, just him saying, "Go fix it," like it was a PR issue. I nodded slowly and sat across from her, my phone already recording from the pocket of my cardigan because I didn't trust myself to remember every lie, every deflection, and I didn't trust her not to gaslight me about this moment later, especially not after what I'd found in Robert's files. "Did you know your father tried to call you the night before he died?" I asked, watching her face for the flinch, and it came. A slight twitch in her jaw, followed by a defensive shrug. I had my phone on silent. We were out for dinner. Marcus planned this surprise thing, and she caught herself mid-sentence, like she realized how ridiculous it sounded, and I just let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable enough that she started filling it with more half-formed excuses. "I meant to call him back. I did, but I didn't know it was serious. He never said anything about being sick. You didn't either." And I kept my expression neutral because I didn't want her to see how much that line hurt. How quickly she tried to shift the blame onto me, like it was my fault she didn't show up. Like Robert's death was a scheduling error we all shared responsibility for. "He wasn't sick, Sarah. He had a heart attack at the breakfast table, 5 minutes after joking about the bread," I said flatly, and she looked away, rubbing her forehead like this conversation was a burden, like I was making things worse by refusing to smooth it over. Then I leaned forward and said it plainly. "I found the transfers," and her whole body stiffened like I'd dropped a match into gasoline. "What transfers?" she said too quickly, too loudly, and I didn't bother to ease her into it. "The ones from Dad's account to yours," Marcus's medical bills, your vacation, the rent shortfall. Don't lie to me, Sarah. Not now. And she had the audacity to look offended. Those were loans, Mom. We were going through a rough patch. Dad offered. And that's when I handed her the folded yellow letter, the one Robert wrote, but never sent. The one where he told Sarah that if she lied again, the money would stop. She read it in silence, then folded it back up like it wasn't the most damning piece of evidence of who she'd become and said, he didn't mean that. And I realized I wasn't talking to my daughter anymore. Not the girl who used to fall asleep on Robert's chest during Sunday football. Not the teenager who helped build her father's shed in the backyard, but a woman who had learned how to rationalize her own betrayal. And I felt nothing but cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't someone who made a mistake. This was someone who had made a choice over and over to prioritize her own comfort over our family. And now she was here because Marcus had told her to salvage what was left. I stood up, walked to the door, and said, I'll let you know if I need anything from you. And she looked like she wanted to say something, but Marcus honked from the driveway and she just nodded, walking out without a hug, without a single question about how I was holding up. And I watched her get in the car, watched Marcus glance at the house with that smirk he probably didn't even realize he wore when he thought he'd won something. And I thought, you have no idea what's coming. The morning after Sarah's visit, I woke up with a calmness that almost scared me, the kind that comes not from peace but from decision. And I didn't even make coffee before calling Alan Klein, our longtime attorney, the man who handled Robert's business filings for decades and sent us birthday cards without fail. When I told him I needed to revise my will immediately, he didn't ask questions, just scheduled me for the next day, and I gathered everything. Bank statements, the folder of Sarah's transfers, Robert's unsent letter, and the audio file of Sarah's pathetic half-confession from the day before. Then I added one final item, a handwritten letter to Emma, our granddaughter, to be opened on her 18th birthday. Because whatever else happened in this family, that little girl deserved to know the truth, not the version her father would spin or the silence Sarah would try to pass off as dignity. When I walked into Alan's office, he took one look at my face and said, I assume this is about more than estate planning. And I nodded, handed him the documents, and said, everything goes into a trust, every account, every asset, the house, the annuity, Robert's stocks, but not for Sarah, not for Marcus, not a cent. And he didn't blink, just opened a legal pad and started writing. We structured it so that Emma would inherit everything, but not until she turned 25, with early access only for educational expenses and housing. No luxury cars, no guilt-driven teenage bribes, and I asked Alan to include a clause that if Sarah or Marcus ever attempted to challenge the will, Emma would gain full control immediately and they'd forfeit all rights, including visitation during the trust's active years, which I knew sounded harsh. But when a parent chooses a party over a funeral and a spouse chooses manipulation over mourning, you stop worrying about diplomacy and start protecting the only piece of your husband still left on earth. Alan reviewed everything twice, added a section for the letter I'd written, sealed in a manila envelope labeled for Emma on her 18th birthday, and included a transcript of Sarah's visit confirming the deception, the financial abuse, and the emotional abandonment. And then he looked at me and said, this is solid, Margaret. No loopholes, no weak points, but it's going to hit her hard. And I said, that's the point, Alan. It's supposed to. The final draft was notarized and filed within an hour, and I walked out feeling not like I'd won, but like I'd reclaimed something, a boundary, a line in the sand Robert had never quite been able to draw. And it wasn't revenge, it was reality. If my daughter wanted to treat her parents like ATM machines with no expiration date, then she'd find out just how long that machine had been watching, documenting, waiting for the exact moment to cut the cord. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and reread the letter I wrote to Emma, 6 pages of truth, not bitterness, explaining who her grandfather really was, what he'd done for her mother, and how that kindness had been turned into leverage and lies.
I told her the money she would one day receive wasn't a gift, it was a responsibility, a reminder to choose love over convenience, loyalty over appearances, and courage over compliance, because she was the only one left in our family who still had a chance to do it right. When I sealed that envelope, I felt like I'd closed a chapter, not of grief, but of silence.
The kind that creeps in when people you love betray you slowly enough that you forget it's betrayal at all. Until one day you're standing at a funeral with no one beside you. And now, finally, I had made sure that silence would not be passed down. The letter landed in Sarah's mailbox 4 days after I left Alan's office, sent by certified mail with a delivery confirmation slip that hit my inbox at 11:13 a.m. And I imagined her standing in her kitchen, flipping through envelopes like it was any other Wednesday until she saw the law firm's logo stamped in the corner. And I knew the moment she opened it because she didn't call, didn't text, didn't email, not that day, not the next, but Marcus did. And not with words, just with a string of rapid-fire texts that ranged from passive-aggressive, "Wow, classy Margaret," to openly hostile, "You're unbelievable. Do you even care about Emma?" And I didn't reply because that silence was the most honest thing I could give them. When I finally picked up the phone on the third day, it was Sarah calling from a blocked number. Her voice was low, uncertain, almost soft, like she thought maybe if she used the tone she used when she was 6 and scared to admit she's broken something, I'd melt into the mom she remembered from before this all turned to ash. She started with, "Mom, I just got the letter." Like I didn't already know, like the last 72 hours hadn't been thick with the weight of her reaction. And I said nothing, just let the silence speak. And when she finally said, "Is this real?" I answered, "You tell me," because there was nothing left to explain. And the pause that followed felt like the longest 10 seconds of my life before she finally said, "I didn't know Dad felt that way." And I snapped, not screamed, not raged, just snapped into ice. "You didn't know because you never asked, Sarah. You were too busy pretending we were optional." And that was when Marcus picked up on the other line, his voice sharp, demanding, "You can't actually disinherit your own daughter. That's insane." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable he was. How quickly the mask dropped when the money dried up. And I said, "I didn't disinherit her. I protected Emma." And Marcus scoffed, "From us," like he couldn't even conceive of himself as a threat. And I answered, "From this moment, this conversation, this entitlement." And before he could spit out whatever venom he had next, I hung up because that was the boundary. Now you don't get to choose neglect and then demand access. You don't get to opt out of grief and then claim inheritance. You don't get to erase the funeral and then rewrite the will. I sat at the kitchen table afterward, same spot where Robert's heart gave out, staring at the quiet that followed, and for the first time since the service, I felt something close to stillness, not happiness, not closure, but control, like I had finally done the thing Robert couldn't bring himself to do before it was too late. Later that night, I got one more text from Sarah. It just said, "I don't know how we come back from this." And I didn't reply because the answer wasn't mine to give anymore. It was Emma's. And one day, when she was old enough to understand everything, she would decide who earned a place in her future, and that was the legacy I was leaving behind. They showed up on a Sunday afternoon without warning. Marcus stepped out of the car in sneakers too pristine for a driveway confrontation, and Sarah trailing behind him like she wasn't sure whether she was there to support him or contain him. And the second I opened the front door, he started in, not with a greeting, not with a question, but with an accusation. "You're manipulating this family through legal threats," his voice sharp and practiced like he'd rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror. And I stood in the doorway without moving, not inviting them in, not budging an inch, just letting the weight of his words hit the silence between us. And then he added, "You're punishing us for setting boundaries." And that was when I saw it, the smug tilt of his head, the belief that somehow he still held the moral high ground. Even after skipping Robert's funeral, even after siphoning money through Sarah, even after trying to play victim in a story he wrote with his own hands, I said nothing, just stepped aside enough for them to come in. Mostly because I knew Emma was upstairs in the hallway, half listening, like all kids do, and something in me needed her to witness this, not to hurt her, but to protect her, to give her truth as armor. Marcus strutted into the living room, his cologne heavy, his words heavier, and Sarah sat down quietly, eyes on the floor, while he took the lead like he always did. We talked to a lawyer, he said, arms crossed. And if this will isn't revised, we may have grounds to question your capacity. And that's when I finally spoke, calm and low. Are you threatening to declare me mentally unfit? And Marcus shrugged. I'm just saying it's not unheard of. Grief does strange things to people, and I saw Sarah flinch at that, whether from guilt or shame, I couldn't tell. And then I heard the faint creak of the hallway floor upstairs, Emma shifting her weight, listening, and I knew every word being spoken was being absorbed by the only person in this family who still had a chance to see clearly. I turned to Sarah and asked, "Do you agree with him?" And she didn't answer, just swallowed and looked away. And that silence was louder than anything Marcus had said because it confirmed what I needed to know. She wouldn't stop him, she wouldn't stand up to him, she wouldn't defend her mother or her father's memory. Not when it meant risking conflict in her own home. Marcus took that silence as fuel, stepped closer and said, "You're tearing this family apart over money," and I laughed. Not loud, not mocking, just a single dry laugh, the kind you let out when something's so absurd it crosses into tragedy. And I said, "I'm tearing it apart. Robert died alone. His own daughter didn't show up, and you're worried about the inheritance." And that was when I saw Emma step into the hallway, halfway down the stairs, eyes wide but steady. And Marcus turned, startled. But Emma didn't say a word, just looked at her mother, then me, then walked slowly back upstairs, and the weight of that silent moment hung in the room like a storm cloud waiting to break. Marcus noticed it too, his expression faltering for the first time, and he said, "She doesn't understand." And I replied, "She understands more than you think." And then I opened the front door, held it wide, and said, "We're done here." And Sarah stood without protest, walked out ahead of Marcus, and he hesitated for 1 second, like he might say something else, but instead he followed, sneakers squeaking against the towel, and I shut the door behind them before his last step hit the porch. It was 3 weeks after that confrontation when I found it, a small black flash drive inside an envelope tucked into my mailbox. No note, no label, just my name written in Emma's careful 12-year-old handwriting. And my heart dropped because I knew instantly it wasn't something playful or innocent. This wasn't a drawing or a digital birthday card. This was something serious, something secret. And when I plugged it into my laptop, I sat in silence as folders opened themselves to me like tiny windows into a world I hadn't been allowed to see. Each one named by date, each filled with files that made my stomach twist. Recordings of phone calls, screenshots of text messages, even a few videos filmed from behind her bedroom door, shaky but clear enough to catch every word Marcus and Sarah had thought were safely tucked behind closed conversations. In one recording, Marcus was yelling, his voice sharp and fast. "She's manipulating everyone with that and if Emma sides with her, I swear to God, Sarah will pull her out of that school and homeschool her until she gets her head on straight." And in another, Sarah's voice was quieter, but somehow worse. "Just let Mom run her game. It's not like we were counting on the money right now anyway. And if Emma plays nice, she can still help us later." And I sat there frozen, listening to my own daughter talk about my estate like it was a strategy board, like I was some dying pawn instead of her living, breathing mother. But the worst part came in a video labeled Kitchen Night, where Marcus, standing by the sink, whispered into his phone, "If we push just a little harder, she'll crack. We'll say she's confused, maybe get the lawyer to question her state of mind." And then boom, the trust gets flagged. And I wrote a new letter to Emma, sealed and dated. to be opened if anything ever happened to me before she turned 18, because I needed her to know that not only did I believe her, I trusted her, and that if she ever needed to stand in front of a judge, a school counselor, or anyone else who questioned her sanity, she'd have proof that she saw it all and never looked away. That night, I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I just sat in Robert's chair, holding that tiny flash drive in my palm like it was a grenade and a gift all at once. And I made a vow not just to protect Emma's inheritance, but to protect her voice, because in this family, she was the first one brave enough to use it. The mediation took place in a neutral office downtown, a beige room with polite furniture and bottled water on a glass table. The kind of place designed to feel non-threatening while everyone inside prepares to go to war. And when Sarah and Marcus walked in, Marcus dressed like he was going to a courtroom drama audition, and Sarah looking 10 years older than she had a month ago, I didn't greet them, didn't offer a smile, just sat with Alan at my side, the folder containing Emma's flash drive, the bank transfers, Robert's unsent letter, and the transcript of Sarah's recorded visit stacked neatly in front of me, like a quiet threat wrapped in paper. The mediator introduced herself and began with a warm, neutral tone, asking why we were here, and Marcus immediately launched into his narrative, painting me as grief-stricken and vengeful, suggesting my decisions were driven by emotional instability and potential cognitive decline. And I watched him rehearse his victimhood like a script he'd memorized, while Sarah sat beside him, silent, face drawn, eyes darting away every time I looked at her. And when it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice, didn't tremble. I just passed the folder across the table and said, "This is why." And I watched the mediator flip through page after page of documentation, dates, transactions, handwritten notes, the audio file list, and finally Emma's flash drive, with a simple printed label, evidence. And I knew the moment the room shifted, the exact second the weight of truth broke the illusion Marcus had been spinning, because the mediator paused, looked up, and asked Marcus directly, "Were you aware that your daughter recorded statements about attempting to alter a legal trust through manipulation?" And Marcus's face drained of color as he sputtered, "She's 12, she doesn't understand the context." But it was too late. The words were out, the recordings existed, and the facade crumbled fast. The mediator turned to Sarah and asked if she'd like to speak, and she said nothing, just rubbed her hands together like she was trying to erase fingerprints from her own guilt. And I said, "She tried to warn you." And that's when Marcus exploded, not with words of defense, but fury, pure unfiltered rage, slamming his hand on the table and yelling, "This is all because you couldn't handle your husband dying. Now you're trying to punish us because you're lonely." And the mediator calmly asked him to step outside for a moment to collect himself, and Marcus stormed out, sneakers echoing in the hallway, leaving Sarah behind. And for the first time since Robert's funeral, Sarah finally spoke directly to me, her voice small, tired. "I didn't know it had gotten that bad." And I said, "You didn't want to know." And she nodded slowly, staring at the floor. "I just wanted peace." And I told her, "You don't get peace from silence. You get it from standing up when it matters." And when the mediator returned, she informed us that there was no basis to challenge the trust, that it was legally sound, morally justified, and based on overwhelming documentation, and that Emma's statements held weight as evidence of undue pressure within the household. Marcus didn't come back in, not even to hear the outcome, and Sarah left shortly after, quietly, without a handshake, without a look back, and I stayed behind for a moment, gathering my things, and felt the strangest sensation wash over me. Not triumph, not relief, but a kind of settled sorrow, the kind that comes when you realize the battle's over, not because you won, but because the truth finally made it impossible for anyone to keep pretending otherwise. Emma turned 18 last Friday, and the day came not with balloons or cake, but with a quiet knock on my door just after noon, her eyes wide but steady as she stepped inside and handed me the letter I'd written her 5 years ago, unopened, still sealed, and said, "I wanted to read it with you." And I didn't say anything,
just nodded and watched as she carefully opened the envelope like it might break apart in her hands, unfolding the 6 pages I had poured my soul into back when everything felt like it was collapsing. And she read silently for several minutes, her face shifting from focus to tears, pausing only once to ask, "Is all of this still true?" And I said, "Every word." And she hugged me tighter than she ever had, whispering, "Thank you for telling me the truth when no one else would." And I felt every ounce of pain and purpose inside that hug. After we sat down in Robert's old chair together, she pulled out her phone and showed me a short video, her standing in front of a judge at a legal name change hearing, saying clearly, "I'd like to change my middle name to Margaret after my grandmother." And I couldn't stop the tears then, couldn't hold back the way my chest cracked open at the sound of her reclaiming her identity, choosing a part of this family that didn't hurt her, didn't lie to her, didn't treat her like leverage. Later that afternoon, we went to her graduation ceremony, and as she crossed the stage and they called out her full new name, Emma Margaret Whitfield, she looked right at me and smiled, and I saw in her face not just pride, but clarity, the kind Robert used to wear when he made hard decisions that no one else understood until it was too late. Sarah was there too, sitting alone in the back row,
watching her daughter choose a name that honored the woman she had betrayed. And as Emma walked off that stage, diploma in hand, I realized that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the courage to choose truth over comfort, love over convenience, and integrity over easy silence. Robert would have been proud, not just of Emma, but of the choice I finally made to break the cycle. Sometimes protecting the people you love means cutting off the ones who refuse to love them back. The legacy continues, but this time, it's in the right hands. Thank you for always listening to stories on this channel. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment as you stay glued for more stories.